Yeah, I'm just wondering. Cathryn, is Carol coming? No. Karen. Okay, cool.
Well, she hasn't told me she's not.
No worries. Thank you. So I declare open this public hearing of the Senate Environment and Communication References Committee inquiry into waste reduction and recycling policies. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay our respects to the elders past and present. On behalf of the committee, I welcome everybody here today. This is a public hearing and a Hansard transcript of the proceedings is being made. The hearing is also being broadcast via the Australian Parliament House website. Before the committee starts taking evidence, I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such an action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also contempt to give false and misleading evidence to a committee. The committee generally prefers evidence to be given in public, but under the Senate's resolutions, witnesses have the right to request to be heard in private session. If a witness objects to answering a question, the witness should state the ground upon which the objection is taken, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer having regard to the ground on which it is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. Such a request may, of course, be made at any other time. I remind people in the hearing room to ensure that their mobile phones are switched to silent, including senators. And the committee has set Friday, 21st of February as a date for answers for questions on notice to be provided. So I now welcome Professor John Thwaites. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and evidence has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Thanks, Senator. John Thwaites, and I'm the former chair of the Circular Economy Ministerial Advisory Group.
Great. Would you like to make a short opening statement and then we'll ask you some questions?
Thanks, Senator. Yes, as I indicated, I chaired the Circular Economy Ministerial Advisory Group, which was established by the Environment Minister, the Honourable Tanya Plibersek, in early 2023. And we provided our final report to the government in December last year, which I understand has been circulated to members of the committee. Just to give a little bit of background, that advisory group was set up following the commitment of all environment ministers around Australia to transition Australia to a circular economy by 2030. And we were set up to provide advice to the government on the opportunities associated with the circular economy for Australia, the barriers, and also to give some examples of best practice that government could implement. We were a group of experts from around the country. We had very extensive stakeholder engagement. I think we engaged with more than 250 stakeholders around the country. We held 5 major workshops with industry, the food industry, plastics, Chemistry Australia, and superannuation and investors. And as I say, we took all of that information and put it in our interim report and then in our final report. And in terms of our key recommendations, it's probably worth highlighting a few of those. First, in our interim report, for the Australian government to have a sustainable procurement policy that incorporates the circular economy, and that has now been implemented. Also, for the circular economy to be embedded in key government policies, such as the Critical Minerals Strategy or the National Reconstruction Fund, and that has occurred as well. And for a Productivity Commission inquiry, which is now underway. And that was our interim report. And then turning to our final report, our key recommendations were first that Australia needs a national framework and policy for the circular economy, which we didn't have, and most comparable countries did have. And that recommendation has now been adopted, and just before Christmas the government released the framework for the circular economy, which I presume the committee also has, which has a key goal of doubling circularity in Australia. And that was our first recommendation. Our second was that we need a new Circular Economy Act for Australia. We don't think that the current Recycling and Waste Reduction Act is sufficient or fit for purpose. And importantly, we recommended that that Act contain a power for the Commonwealth to set standards for products, similar to the European Union Eco-Design for Sustainable Products legislation. And that means things like durability, repairability, so that we already set standards for water efficiency and energy efficiency, but we don't do anything about durability or repairability. And we need that. Second recommendation we made in relation to that legislation is we do need stronger product stewardship legislation. We heard in our stakeholder engagements that the current system is not working sufficiently. There are too many problems with the non-mandatory product stewardship schemes where you have free riders not taking part, and it's not providing a comprehensive end-to-end product stewardship that we need. And so we recommended that there be a regulatory framework for product stewardship that provides an enhanced focus on mandatory participation. So that was our second key recommendation. The third one was to have a new governance system that harmonises circular economy standards around the country. The states have a lot of the regulatory tools here. The Commonwealth has some of them. They're not being brought together. And in fact, what we heard was that the inconsistency in approaches around the country could actually be a barrier to the circular economy. And of course, that flows through to more waste and more unnecessary emissions. Just for example, the container deposit schemes, I think we've got 6 around the country. We don't want 6 battery schemes or 6 solar PV schemes. We need one national scheme because we are one country and one market. But to achieve that, we need a governance process to achieve that. And we recommended that there could be something like the Australian Building Codes Board for building regulations for the circular economy. And that was our key recommendation. And then just one other recommendation I might highlight was around a place-based approach to the circular economy, that we did see some really great initiatives, for example, the Geiger Circular Economy Initiative, where in a regional area, local government, business, the community came together around a circular economy. And we believe the Commonwealth should support that process in different places around the country. So that's a quick snapshot of our recommendations.
Great, thank you, Professor Thwaites. So, just to clarify for us, so you said you're the ex-head of the task force. Is that because the task force is no longer existing?
Yes, sorry. The task force wound up at Christmas with our final report.
Okay, and was that a planned date for it to wind up?
That was the plan, yes.
Right. Okay, and then you release your final report, which is great, which I've read. Okay, thank you for.
And I think it's fair to say that it's created quite a momentum. The task force, the advisory group is working closely together, and we will continue to work with government and the community in a less formal way. But the formal appointment was to provide this report, and we've now done that.
Could I ask, just as a technicality, you may have already considered it, but is there any way for the task force to provide its report as feedback to the RAW Act review that's currently underway, given you make some pretty substantial recommendations for reform and you've made some really constructive criticisms of deficiencies in the RAW Act?
Absolutely. And as I understand that the Ministerial Advisory Group's report is an input into that review, and the department is managing the review, but the department also supported our report and I might say did so very competently. Yep. And the department has taken a very proactive role working with our group, aimed at implementation. So we didn't want our report just to be some report that sits on the shelf. A lot of what we did was make iterative recommendations which were then taken up by the department, and then taken to other departments for implementation. And an example of that would be, say, the National Reconstruction Fund, where right at the start we saw the circular economy as a real opportunity for that. We had the Minister, Ed Husic, attend our meeting of the Ministerial Advisory Group, and he agreed, and the departments worked together to implement that recommendation. So it's a really iterative process.
Okay, excellent. So just could I perhaps ask you to explain to the committee, I'm not assuming everyone's read the final report, just explain very briefly your concerns around the RAW Act and mandated product stewardship schemes. You basically said, my interpretation of it, it would be hard to bring in new design rules, for example, tailored design rules for different waste streams under the existing Act, because you need a whole, it's either a voluntary scheme or a mandatory scheme or somewhere in between, and that's too difficult to do. Is that a good interpretation of?
Well, the first big gap is the lack of a legislative power to set standards for products.
Yeah.
And the government should be able to do that apart from a product stewardship scheme.
Right.
The only way you can do it now is via a mandatory product stewardship scheme. But it is much more efficient and effective if there's a power to set standards. And the example I sometimes give just from personal experience is toasters, say. I get very frustrated by the fact a toaster lasts 6 months and then you throw it out and get a new one. You're not going to set up a product.
You need a toaster.
Yeah. Well, we have a lot of rubbish products out there.
That's so true.
And if you don't need a whole product stewardship scheme to work on that. You need a system for durability and repair. And I think you've seen potentially some media about that in terms of farm equipment too, and farmers being able to repair their own agricultural equipment and not being able to because they can't get the information about how to repair it. And being able to set those standards,
like a right to repair law.
a right to repair, but repairability. So products are made in a way that they can be repaired. So that's the first and probably the key gap that we've got now. The second thing relates to product stewardship schemes themselves, and we heard time and time again that they weren't working because they weren't mandatory, there were free riders, and it meant that the companies doing the right thing were essentially subsidising those that weren't. And we need a mandatory scheme that all companies have to comply with, so you've got a level playing field. And the current Act is pretty complex and difficult in that regard. We recommended that there needs to be a regulatory framework that sets a clear pathway to mandatory product stewardship. And the other important aspect of this that we said is you have to have adequate resources to do this too. And the department has to be adequately resourced to implement those mandatory product stewardship schemes.
Okay, thank you. I'm so glad to hear you say that, as someone who's been raising this issue for at least 15 years about a regulated binding mandatory scheme. More broadly than that, you've also recommended a Circular Economy Act. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, and also your comments around the standards, the power for standards, with what we've seen overseas, for example, in the EU? Is that essentially what you based your reform recommendations on? That's correct.
We recommended that we have a National Circular Economy Act that incorporates the type of standard setting powers that the EU legislation has. The Eco Design for Sustainable Products legislation, which enables the setting of standards for durability, repairability, and also provides schemes for enforcement of that. So we recommended that should apply for within Australia, and we said it could either be achieved through amendment of the existing RAW Act or through a new act.
Okay. And have you received any feedback from the department or the minister on that at all, or is it still in the process where the report's being? So I might step back. Is there going to be any kind of response process to the task force or otherwise from the government in relation to your final report?
I think you'd have to ask the department that,
okay.
and we've presented our report, and we're obviously hopeful of implementation, but it's a matter for the department what they do with it. I should say, to date, the government has been very proactive in responding to our recommendations. I think we had 11 ministers attend our meetings for substantial amounts of time, including the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers. And, for example, we made the recommendation about the Productivity Commission inquiry. He implemented that. We also made a recommendation that the measuring what matters indicators incorporate the circular economy as part of the Treasury Wellbeing Framework, and that has now been achieved. So I feel quite confident that the government is moving in this direction and taking our recommendations seriously. Okay,
that's great to hear. In terms of the European, the legislation you looked at in the EU, have you got any thoughts on how successful that's been?
Well, it was only implemented in July last year, so I think it's too early to say. But what you can say is that a number of individual countries in Europe have already implemented similar approaches, and it has been demonstrably successful in countries like the Netherlands, where their circularity rate, I can't quote you exactly, but it's 20-something% compared to 4% in Australia. You are seeing a number of individual European countries well ahead of Australia and demonstrating the advantages of this approach. Okay, thank you.
Do you have any thoughts in relation to, we've received evidence from numerous submitters and
Sorry, could you speak up?
We've received evidence from numerous submitters and verbal evidence in the inquiry around saying the government should look at policy levers like the UK's tax on, for example, virgin plastic. Did the task force look at any of those kind of economic incentives?
We did, and we had a whole session and a section on economic levers, and there's a whole range. There's subsidies, tax incentives. We referred to them, but essentially we saw the best way to explore them was via the Productivity Commission. Right. And, frankly, the Productivity Commission is probably going to have more credibility on an analysis of economic levers than our group. And while we saw opportunities in those economic levers, we saw that doing a Productivity Commission would allow a real exploration of those levers. I mean, we did hear of some cases where tax incentives didn't necessarily work so well in Europe around repair, where for one reason or another there are unintended consequences. So we believe that those things need to be properly explored and robustly explored in order to ensure that you get the best outcome.
And have you any idea when the Productivity Commission's going to finish that report?
Well, I think they've got an interim report coming out in March, and then there'll be a comment period and then a final report.
No worries. I might follow up with them when that interim report is in March, because that might be useful for our Senate report. Thank you for passing that on. I've just got a couple more questions, and I'll go to fellow senators. You were quite specific about the mandated targets versus voluntary targets, for example, packaging targets, for the free rider issue. Did you have consultations with APCO in writing your reports? Or did you just use existing data?
We had consultations with a lot of the businesses.
Right.
I am not sure whether I personally didn't have a direct conversation with the people from APCO, but I should also say there was a parallel process of the new packaging regulation. So we tended to want to be above the nitty-gritty detail of specific product stewardship processes and say what are the principles that should be applied.
Yeah. Indeed. It's just that they've obviously presented to us that they've got an eco-modulation process they're working on at the moment, which they're putting up as the model to go forward for packaging. Just wondering if the task force had any views on that.
We didn't, and we didn't go into that level of detail.
No worries. So yes, you've recommended principles, the guiding principles for government. We heard from Visy in their submission to the Senate that they don't want any more principles. They want rules. I mean, obviously that wasn't your job to get into that nitty-gritty. They don't want guidelines out there. They want rules.
And that's consistent with our recommendations.
Yeah.
That our recommendation is to have a legislative framework, have a new act which allows government to set rules. Those standards would be rules, but as an advisory group, we didn't see it as our role to set the rule ourselves, but to say the government should have that power. But importantly also, it needs to be one that is done in a consistent way across the states and the Commonwealth. What we don't want to have is different rules in different states and the Commonwealth. That will impede action.
Professor, how do we get around that? Because I've been looking at this stuff for 15, 20 years, and I've seen the states go it alone on things from container deposit schemes, as you pointed out, through to plastic bag and straw bans, and now they're looking at batteries in New South Wales. I mean, is the Circular Economy Act the legislative framework to give the Commonwealth more participation, or does it come down to the politics of it, like that, where the Commonwealth government says we're going to take leadership on a national scheme, for example?
It needs a national cooperative approach. Neither the states nor the Commonwealth have exclusive jurisdiction. They've both got constitutional powers over important aspects of the circular economy. So the best way forward, in our view, was for a cooperative agreement between the Commonwealth and the states around the circular economy and the actions that are going to be taken. And the model that we said could be looked at is that Australian Building Codes Board model. I've got personal experience with that. I was chair of the Australian Building Codes Board for some years, and that approach put the Commonwealth and the states and industry around the table to jointly design standards for Australian buildings. It's not perfect. Nothing ever is, but it's a lot better than what we had before, which was each state completely going it alone. I think you'll find if you tried to do this in the circular economy, you'll have the same issue where some states will say, maybe we're prepared to do it, but we don't want to be bound by it, and that's probably, you'll have to accept that. But it's a lot better to at least have a principle that you're going to try to collaborate on this. Another example is in infrastructure. So in Victoria, they're doing some really good work on using recycled products in the big build, in major freeways and bridges, etc. What you see, though, is that the standards are set for things like the percentage of recycled material in asphalt can be different across the country. And yet we've got one infrastructure and construction industry. So that's going to add to costs and cause delays. So if we could get an agreement between the Commonwealth and the states, we will set common standards. For example, the amount of asphalt you're going to have in roadway, or the percentage of recycled product in various pieces of infrastructure. You're going to get much more effective outcomes.
Okay. Senator Cadell.
Thank you.
I'll go to you.
Just going on some different variations in your final report, you mentioned the cost of living. You benefited, I think, about 11% from the EU, $965 a year, or roughly. And I think that's a very big important. If we start designing more robust products and we get serviceability, but there is the upfront transition costs where we're not buying via Chinese websites or fast delivery. Do you think that, and I go to the paradox of poverty, that those without disposable income tend to pay more because they can't save for bulk or they can't do that. What can we do to help those people in that transition? Is this why we've gone to the Productivity Commission to look at that economic analysis? Because I think when you can repair stuff, and your example says instead of buying a new one for 600, you repair it for 150 or 300, I think those sorts of things. That's my concern, is those without disposable income at the moment when things are tough. We go to this design rule, which long-term will help them. I have no concern with that. But when they're not going and buying Anko or Temu or anything like this, how do we help those people at the beginning?
So our committee didn't go into that in detail, and that wasn't the focus of our work. We did highlight that there are reports that show, as you quoted in the EU, a report that indicated that having more durable products could lead to a higher disposable income because you don't have to keep buying new stuff. In terms of how you meet that challenge of upfront costs against long-term saving, that's the same challenge that we've got with energy efficiency, with water efficiency, all of these things. And a good first step is labelling and consumer information so that at least consumers know when they're buying a product how long it's potentially going to last, or is it repairable. So we did recommend that as well as durability and repairability standards, there be standards for consumer information around those things. Yeah. And that does give the consumer the opportunity to at least understand what they're getting when they buy products. But overall, I think and this is more a personal view now rather than the committee, is if you provide for these standards, the market will move to it. Correct. And the competitive pressures will drive the cost down. And so over time, that's going to be of benefit. I
agree with all of that, just that initial change. And the other thing is, we mentioned farm. I don't know how the EU standards on repairability have gone across different components. I haven't gone that far, so you may be able to slap me down on this. I'm concerned when we've talked about agricultural products, and I'm talking about where there are other benefits to the economy by efficiency and complication that is not repairable. So if I get a national farm, if I get a sprayer or a seeder or something like that, now I've got GPS, self-drive, correct seeds per acre, fertiliser per acre, this sort of stuff. That's not repairable. I'm not going to pull out, computer chips and work out that's going. That stuff is exempt. So or XY Falcon. If I jump in an XY Falcon, I can stand in the engine bay and fix a carby and a spark plug. Well, new cars I can't, but an XY Falcon chooses like 1 million gallons per kilometre. Are we going to hurt the planet by going to worse outcomes on efficiency by doing this? Is that happening in the UK, or they're leaving those things alone?
If products are repairable, it means that you're investing a bit of effort into servicing the product, repairing it, as opposed to throwing it out and buying an entirely new product. In terms of generally the impact on the planet is going to be a lot better with the former than the latter. And what we're doing as a society now is taking stuff out of the ground, making it into something, using it for a while and then dumping it at massive levels, and that's one of the major causes of greenhouse gas emissions, because we produce so much stuff and it doesn't last long enough. So generally, if we can turn that around, we'll be doing the right thing by the planet.
And I agree with that, ESG, because the countries that are building these cheap goods don't have the highest human rights standards, they don't have the highest wages, they don't have those same things. So there's another good on the other side where we can actually put some quality back into the system and have some accountability. So I think that's good. You wound up. What's the next thing? What for you? What is there? Is there a hint of a sequel or anything like this? Or
Well, it's interesting that the Ministerial Advisory Group itself have really collaborated well and are going to continue to talk. And so we talk at conferences, we'll be involved in different activities. Yeah, it doesn't just come to an end. And most of the people on the Ministerial Advisory Group are already involved in the circular economy already.
Yep.
So they're either in Engineers Australia or organisations like that are going to continue to be involved. And for myself, I'm at Monash University, Monash Sustainable Development Institute. In fact, today we're holding at Monash a whole all-day workshop on the circular economy. And so it's going to be an ongoing thing for most of the group, I would say.
you specifically mentioned, just by example, asphalt.
Yeah.
I've got some mines around me. I've got some power stations around me in the Hunter Valley. Lots of fly ash sitting in dams that were waste and they didn't know what to do with now. And suddenly there's a pent-up demand. They're now seeing it as an asset because the fly ash inclusion into highways and roads. But they are capped at 20%. And I'm kept being told it's because the concrete companies or the other companies don't want to include it more just from a profit basis. Are we up against entrenched interest in reusing our products and in this circular economy in that sort of way?
Well, I'm not expert enough to say, are we up against entrenched interest in this case? I mean, generally we are, because in everything, existing interests are going to look to protect their own business, which is understandable. But there are innovations around the world that are moving really fast, and we should get on board with that. In Victoria, they have this organisation, EcoLogic, which is part of the government department that delivers the big projects, and it has been amazingly successful at changing the culture of the contractors who do the construction work. And these contractors 5 years ago wouldn't have thought of using recycled product, and now they're totally supportive and engaged. So what we need to be doing is providing the information to industry and business about what can be achieved. And one of the things that we recommend in our report is to have what's called transition brokers. That is, people with a level of expertise in the transition to the circular economy who can advise business about what's needed. Because they don't have the time or the ability to go out and find it for themselves. But if we can provide that information to them, they'll take it up.
Yeah, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Karen, would you like to ask some questions, or Cathryn?
We'll start with Senator Miller.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you and the team for the work that you've done. It's been really amazing, and I'm pleased that the government have moved quickly to implement the primary recommendations. Can you just talk us through what the process sort of was around the advisory group to come to the 14 recommendations in the final report? And then following that, I'm really interested in recommendation 11 in particular, which was defining and building skills in the existing and emerging workforce. Could you expand on that particular recommendation for me? But could you just talk us through the process of how you came to those 14 recommendations?
Sure. So we decided that the circular economy was such a big area and it impacted on different sectors in different ways that we should break our work down into sectors. And we had essentially a meeting around each sector. So we had a meeting around manufacturing and industry and design. We had another one around food. We had one around innovation and the economy. So we broke it down. And in the lead up to each meeting, we held workshops with industry and met with them to inform us before we had the meeting. Then at the meeting, we had the Minister, Tanya Plibersek, who attended all the meetings for the whole time. and she invited her ministerial colleagues that were relevant to come to that meeting. And so we had direct face-to-face with, as I said, I think it was 11 ministers, but also senior public servants as well. So the CEO of the National Reconstruction Fund, for example. And having gone through that process, we then discussed recommendations on each of those sectors, and we made sector-specific recommendations through the time of our reporting. But then we came together at the end to pull all that together and make these broad recommendations. And all of that was supported by the department, and we had a secretariat within the department who did an enormous amount of legwork in getting all the evidence, probably refining some of our less articulate recommendations into something that was comprehensible, that sort of thing. And then they put it back to the group who would then make the recommendation. And I have to say I've been involved in a lot of...
I'm just saying it sounds like a very thorough process.
It was really thorough. And I've been in government myself. I've been through a lot of processes. This was one of the best I've been in because it was so iterative and because there was a commitment to actually make change along the way rather than just get a report and say you've done a report. So that's really how we did it. In terms of it was which recommendation?
11. Defining and building skills in the existing and emerging workforce. Can you just expand on that?
Yep.
point?
So, well, that's an example. So we had a meeting around skills. We had Skills Australia head there, and we had the Minister Brendan O'Connor, who we talked with, and we then heard from industry what they saw as necessary, and then that's how we've come up with these recommendations. But certainly skills are going to be a huge issue, and we also need many professions and occupations to have a better basic understanding and literacy in the circular economy than they do now. So it's not just the engineer who is going to do the circular economy project. We need across all the workforce to have people thinking about a model where we don't just take stuff and dump it, but rather we really think at the start, how can we design a system that's going to be reusable and durable? And that needs to be embedded in our education system as well and training system.
I've just written down education, literally just written the word down. I was going to ask you about that as well. What sort of role do you see? I mean, personally, from my perspective, I see a role from kindergarten up, talking to the children about the importance of it and that sort of thing. But do you sort of agree with that position?
100%. And at the core of a lot of this is design thinking and putting design thinking into our education system, which would be of real benefit to build that as a more general skill that students have.
Great. So what are the other opportunities that you see for Australia, I suppose, in adopting the framework? What's the benefits for us?
Well, one area that I haven't touched on but we believe was really important is partnering with First Nations and utilising First Nations' incredible knowledge and experience of thousands of years in a different approach to caring for country but also for things, so that it's a more durable long-term approach. And we had Professor Robin Quiggin, who has just recently been awarded an AO on our advisory group, and she convened a really interesting workshop with Indigenous leaders, and we see this as a real opportunity to learn from the Indigenous community, particularly in the way we relate to land and regenerating land. So that's one example. Obviously waste and reducing waste, which you're concerned about. A third area is the net zero transition. So there is real opportunities to use the circular economy to reduce carbon emissions. And the CSIRO estimated, I think it's around 16% reduction or 14% reduction in emissions by 2030 and 23% by 2050. And I think you're going to hear from the CSIRO and they'll be able to speak in more detail about that. Biodiversity also, though, the way we do farming and we manage habitat using circular principles there can be real steps forward. And finally, an important opportunity for Australia is the economy. This is a real opportunity for jobs and prosperity. It has been identified in Europe as a real opportunity, but there are some real opportunities in Australia to use the knowledge of the circular economy for new businesses.
Have you got any examples of new businesses?
Yeah, well, we actually give some good examples in the report. So there's a whole bunch.
Thank you, Senator Cadell. You're very helpful.
Samsara Eco, Sienta, Nanosonics, Ulu, Sundrive Solar. These are some examples. But also we're seeing Pact in Victoria, which I visited their manufacturing plant. They're now recycling plastics. They're able to recycle meat trays, for example. So there's numerous opportunities, but most of these businesses say they do need a clear regulatory framework to operate in so that their market is more certain, whereas in Australia it's been too uncertain to date.
Great, thanks. Senator Grogan, I'm not sure if you want to add anything.
So kind of you, Chair, to give us
if you'd
a few
like,
minutes.
Yep, just let me know. Like, happy to go over time.
Professor Thwaites, I'm really interested. Thanks for all your work for a start, but I'm really interested looking forward with the recommendations that you've put. What do you envisage being the greatest challenges to both getting them adopted, but then also their implementation? Obviously, you've spoken to us a bit about the challenges between state and fed, the constitutional issues, responsibilities. We've heard from other witnesses some of those, what you might call sticky problems into the future to actually achieve the goals that we're looking for. Do you want to just step through what you see as some of those challenges?
Yeah. Well, I think the first challenge is people don't understand the circular economy. Like I was downstairs talking to someone in Aussies. They said, "What are you here for?" The circular economy, and they just look blank. So I think that is an issue. If you start to explain it, people think it's good, you know. But we do have a community literacy issue about this. And if you go back to our grandparents' generation, this was embedded in their thinking. You know, I can remember my grandmother would fix everything in the kitchen. These days, it's the complete opposite. We're used to a throwaway society where you just go in and buy something new and ditch it. So I think that cultural attitude to things, to goods, is a big challenge, and that's where behaviour change becomes important and systems change. So in our report we talk about the need to understand behaviour, behavioural science, systems change. So I think that's the first. The second is whenever you have a change, there is a bit of cost associated with the first step. You get longer term benefits, but overcoming that initial cost. And I don't believe that all of these recommendations will happen unless there is some investment, both in time, political priority and funds to get us over that initial hump. Then the third challenge, which we talked about, is the challenge of inconsistency around the country and how you can drive greater consistency. I should say on that, the good thing is that there is incredible agreement about the principles around the country. You know, it's not nearly as politically fraught as a lot of other issues, and it crosses all parties. So I think there is real hope there that we can bring everyone together around this. And then I guess the fourth thing does come around skills and education, which the Senator referred to. So they'd be some of the barriers or challenges that we have to overcome.
Because I do remember when we all started thinking about recycling in a more sort of society-wide fashion, and there was a lot of that done in the schools. And I remember people talking about how they'd learnt a lot of their recycling knowledge from their children who were bringing it home from school, going, okay, well, we've learnt this and we all have to collect this and we all have to collect that. Is there a place for a kind of primary school circular economy sort of educative piece?
Well, I would say yes, but I'd say the parents need to change too. Like, they're the ones who, and I think part of the shift to the multi-bin system and all that needs to be efforts by the councils to really train people to do the right thing and explain it. And once again, to try to have a greater level of consistency. Like, if you go from one municipality to another, you've got different rules about what you can put in which bin, which isn't helpful. I think we should aim as much as possible for consistency. But it also needs to be underpinned by standards and regulation. So just as we've got used to water efficiency now, so that's embedded after the drought, that we have water efficient showers, etc. The next step is embedding that we have more durable, repairable products underpinned by regulation.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks very much.
No, excellent question on challenges. Could I ask on that point in terms of procurement? Obviously, we've been asking questions now about at least the last 5 years into how the Commonwealth Government can play a bigger role in, leading on that procurement, whether it's on the billions of dollars we spend on road, construction around the country and other things. Is there any evidence things have advanced in terms of trials for products, for like glass in road base is one example that we see, but there's recycled plastics as well in construction materials. Where do you see procurement for the demand, I suppose, for recycled content coming from?
Well, I certainly strongly, and we recommended the government has a sustainable procurement policy, which they've now implemented, and it has come into force this year, and it will be expanded next year. So that's really important. And at a state level, I highlighted the example of the big bill in Victoria, and I do think it's worth the committee actually talking with Ecologic, which is the group that does that. In the short term, construction and infrastructure is probably the biggest opportunity in the circular economy to get substantial reduction in emissions and in waste. And we're seeing, in terms of total waste, the one waste stream that continues to rise is construction waste, because we're building more and more things. So if you look at what they've done in Victoria with Ecologic, it has been to encourage the contractors who are doing the building to use recycled product, partly just through information and encouraging them, but there are some financial bonuses they can get as well. And so having the levers that are actually going to change industry needs to be at the forefront. And I think government is going to be the first to move and can set a market. Governments can set up markets. They're massive purchasers of products. And if the government sets standards and expectations, then the market will move towards that.
Okay. Perhaps the last question that relates to that is, are you confident, Professor Thwaites, that in terms of emissions reductions and circularity, or recycling, if you like, as a broader term, is climate action, are you confident enough that one day this kind of thing can be built into the national accounts? We can have emissions reduction targets using, like, iterative, circular approaches to policy. You said you had 11 ministers sitting in on some of your forums or some of your workshops. At what point do you think we can actually budget emissions reductions from these kind of changes? Do you think it'll ever get to that point?
Well, I think we're already reporting pretty substantially on emissions. Like, there's regular reporting by companies, regular reporting by the Australian government on overall emissions, and incorporating circular economy targets and impacts within that, I see as quite possible. I don't see that as a big step at all. And that I hadn't thought about that, but it could be quite a good addition to some of our greenhouse gas reporting to incorporate some of those things.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I would love to keep asking you more questions, but we're now we're now over time. So just on behalf of all the committee, I'd just like to thank you and all your team. I know some of them are here today for all their great work, and hope we can put this into policy. Thank you
very much. Thanks.
Cheers. Yeah, no worries. Okay. So we're just waiting for Senator Cadell to come back, but I might, I'll keep going. Great. Here we go. So, it being 11:10, I now welcome officials from Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, known as CSIRO, via video conference and in person. The Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water, and the Department of Industry, Science and Resources. If you'd like to come forward, please. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and evidence has been provided to you. I remind senators that the Senate has resolved that an officer of the Department of Commonwealth or of State should not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and should be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution prohibits only questions asking for opinions on matters of policy and does not preclude questions asking for explanations or policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. Officers of the department are also reminded that any claim that it would be contrary to the public interest to answer a question must be made by a minister and should be accompanied by a statement setting out the basis for the claim. For the Hansard record, would you each please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today? Maybe if we could go from the left to the right, starting with you, Ms Elliott.
Thank you, Chair. Kate Elliott. Excuse me. Kate Elliott from the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water, from the Wildlife Waste and Environmental Permits branch. Thank you.
Cathryn Geiger, also from the same department, branch head, Partnerships, Infrastructure and Analysis. Chloe Bird, also from DQ. I'm the branch head responsible for Supply Chain Initiatives branch within Circular Economy Division.
Good morning. Cameron Hutchison from the same department, the branch head for the Waste and Resource Recovery Policy branch.
Morning, Chair. Ray Marcello from the Department of Industry, Science and Resources. I'm the head of the Strategic Policy Division.
Thank you.
Good morning. Alessio Miatto from the CSIRO.
Good morning, Chair. Heinz Schandl. I'm the Circular Economy Lead at the CSIRO based here in Canberra.
Fantastic. Would anyone like to make an opening statement? Oh, sorry. I missed. Brett, would you like to go next? Apologies for that.
Certainly, Chair. And hello again. Brett Molony, CSIRO.
Thank you. Yes, would anyone, would each of the three departments like to make a statement? Would you like to make one?
Brett will do one for us.
Brett?
Thank you, Chair. As I said, my name is Dr. Brett Molony. I'm the Environment Science Director for CSIRO. I'm joining you from the Whadjuk lands of the Noongar Nation in Boorloo, also known as Perth, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend my respects to owners of the traditional lands in which we're all meeting. Also extend my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders present today. And I thank the committee and the Chair for being able to attend virtually. I just heard about the emissions reductions before, Chair, so I'm trying to do my part. I'm joined here today by Dr. Heinz Schandl, who is CSIRO's Circular Economy Lead. He's based in Canberra with more than 30 years' experience in industrial ecology, circular economy, and environmental and sustainability policy research. And Dr. Alessio Miatto, Senior Scientist, also based in Canberra, focusing on material flow accounting, urban sustainability and critical minerals. We really appreciate the opportunity to provide information to this committee and note that CSIRO is accompanying representatives from partners from DQ and Geiger. In line with our areas of expertise, CSIRO's focus today is primarily on the scientific and technical aspects of waste reduction and recycling in delivering a circular economy for the benefit of Australia. CSIRO provides evidence-based research used by stakeholders such as government, industry and community to inform regulation and risk assessments. It's not CSIRO's role to comment on policy matters. Our circular economy research aims to support Australia's transition to a circular economy, estimated to contribute over $200 billion to GDP by 2048. Our recent reports in March and September 2024 on Australia's material use and circularity rate found that transport and housing account for more than 50% of this country's material footprint. In 2020, Australia's circularity rate was around 4.6%, which is about half the global average. CSIRO's research helps link policy development, innovative science and collaboration on common waste streams in Australia's economy, including material use and life cycle analysis. CSIRO has worked closely with DQ, the Circular Economy Division, to provide scientific science to support development of the National Circular Economy Policy Framework, which my colleagues have, which was released in December last year. CSIRO is engaging across the innovation system with the government, industry and other agencies to progress science outcomes and create solution options. We welcome questions from the committee and the opportunity to contribute to the inquiry into waste reduction and recycling policies. Thank you, Chair.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? No? Do you want to go first, Senator Grogan?
I'll just direct some of my questions to CSIRO, but please feel free to chip in if you've got something to add. I'm keen to understand the kind of research that you are doing into plastics and recycling. My understanding is that you're doing quite a lot, but I wonder if you could just step through the sort of the span and width of that.
Thank you, Senator. I'll ask Heinz to lead off if I can, please, Heinz.
Yeah, so you don't have the ideal people in the room to answer this question, but we do have out of Clayton a research into plastics and polymers led by Deb Lau. She's also the lead of our Ending Plastics Waste initiative at the CSIRO. And we've done a report on the technical and engineering potential for advanced recycling, which I believe also includes an analysis of the economics of that process. And we'd be very happy to table that report subsequently.
Okay, I certainly have not read that report. Are you able to give us a bit of a flavour of where I'm keen to understand where the research is going, the kind of things that you have on your agenda that you're trying to pursue, but maybe we don't have the right people?
Senator, I can follow up afterwards, but at a very high level, there's a range of initiatives. One is looking at replacements of plastics, and they're in a range of uses from, if you like, cling wraps and other applications, and that's with a collaboration amongst a university partner in Western Australia. We're also supporting small companies and startups looking at using algal sources for a biodegradable plastic type arrangement. And again, I can provide after this more information around that or link you to the right people.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, the one other part is using insect larvae to actually digest some forms of plastics. So there's some insects, black soldier flies are one that have an enzyme that can break some forms of plastic down, and whether we can use that enzyme for in other applications as well.
Okay, yeah, I would love to know more about that. That would be really useful. So, in terms of sort of the ending plastic waste, we've talked to a range of people about this and the complications and the multiple different types of plastic. And where's the hardest? What would you see at this point in time as the hardest piece of that options in the plastic world? What's the hardest thing to overcome in terms of finding either alternative ways or recycling methodology?
If I can start and then hand to Heinz and Alessio. The first one is the amount of plastics used and what you would replace it with. So there's a scale. Another part of it is the waste streams themselves, and as you noted, the large number of different plastics, how to keep the waste streams clean. And waste streams is what Alessio and Heinz are focusing on.
Yeah, I would start by saying separation is really the first step. To have clean waste streams, you want to avoid contamination. As soon as the end-of-life material is contaminated, it's not a good feedstock anymore, neither economically or technically. And then you go into technical processes. You have all options of mechanical and advanced recycling, but you require a virgin polymer industry that can take up a certain amount of secondary material and put it into the production process without a domestic polymer industry or in a much harder place. And you cannot, to my knowledge, do a lot with the end-of-life feedstock.
Because we spent a bit of time with the committee this morning talking about pizza cheese, as you do when you're discussing recycling cardboard. When you talk about cling wraps and soft plastics and things that you actually have no idea what it's going to be wrapping in the home, if you're going down to that sort of domestic level, how do you end up with a clean product to be able to recycle? Or is the answer, and there's another one of these embarrassing coffee cups that's just sort of slid in front of me. Yeah. I hear. What we've been discussing in part is the answer to invest in ways to unpack the thing that can't be recycled very well? Is the answer to find a different way of doing it? And that, obviously, I appreciate that the answer is not one answer for every product, but I'm really interested in where the thinking and where the research is going on that.
Yeah. I would go back to what Professor Thwaites said before. We need some culture change in the way how we interact with the products of daily life that provide the services and that we require. So that is essential. For example, the coffee cup is a really good point in case here. But above that, there are certain procedures which have been introduced into our households, into our businesses, where we are using materials in a way that makes it really hard to bring those materials then back into the process. And so in whichever way we can improve the way how we engage with materials can then help support the circular economy. But I might also want to remind the senators that while plastic is a really important problem from an environmental point of view, and very much on the public consciousness, the volumetric aspect of plastic compared to the total amount of materials we are dealing with is very small. It's less than 1% of all the materials we're using in the economy. So whilst we are needing to find solutions for plastics, which, for example, looking into the CSIRO report by memory, as soon as you go into advanced recycling, the degree of uncontaminated material is less important. And then you can actually engage in processes where you can also deal with mixed and contaminated material, so the industry says. But of course, what the scientists would then do as a next step is to do a life cycle analysis on the process so that we can understand the full impact of the advanced recycling we are engaging in with regard to emissions, to regard to biodiversity, to regard to pollution, toxicity, and material depletion.
Senator, if I may, just coming at it from the department's perspective and without speaking to where CSIRO's research is at, I think when tackling the plastic problem, our approach that we're taking through our highly ambitious position in the plastic pollution treaty negotiations, where we're trying to affect change along the whole life cycle. I think your question went to, is it about better design? I heard Dr. Schandl talk about, better collection and source separation. I think we need to make change along the spectrum. So we need to design our plastics to be more recyclable in the first place. We need to design our plastics so they don't have harmful chemicals that prevent circularity in them. We also need to make sure that our collection systems are easier for people to use and that we are getting the cleanest stream for our reprocessors to use as much as possible. And we also then need end markets for the recyclate, and working out how we can promote that and make sure that that is then your fully circular system for plastic. So I think the challenge is along interventions along the supply chain to make sure we get that right, and absolutely no doubt that the research behind things like advanced recycling and ways we can tackle some of those more difficult plastics, particularly the difficult ones to recycle like soft plastics, we are hopeful that research around the efficacy of advanced recycling and how that can tackle some of the problems holds a lot of promise.
Thank you. If you could table that report after the session, that would be really, really handy. Yep. Thank you very much. I know Senator Bullock's got questions.
I might just come back to you, if you don't mind, Senator, because I've just got a follow-up question from Senator Grogan. So on the design rules, Mr Hutchison, I think it was May estimates last year, I asked the department for an update and they said they'd be releasing those within a few months. So it's been over 6 months now and we haven't seen anything. Could you give us a progress report on how you're going with releasing those, the design rules?
So on packaging...
The packaging in particular.
Yeah. On packaging, Senator, and thank you for the question. In December just gone, Environment Ministers, so the federal, state and territory environment ministers received a brief on detailed guidance. It's to underpin better design of packaging, and what we have done as a department to coincide with that discussion at the environment ministers meeting is release a new design for recyclability framework. So that has been published on the department's website. That was underpinned by a working group of experts that supported us to build on things like APCO's sustainable design guides, the international experience we're seeing in places like the European Union on better packaging design. And what we've released by stream is some guidance on how to get packaging from, say, an unrecyclable point to a more recyclable point. We acknowledge that that is a pretty technically complex piece of work. We've released it with an intent to do more targeted consultation on it to understand what some of the barriers in the Australian context are. I think it's one thing to say that something should be recyclable, but we're also looking to make sure that what we are working and presenting to our stakeholders is relevant to the Australian context, so that it aligns with our collection systems, it aligns with our recycling capacity. So that is something that was released in the kind of in the margins of the Environment Ministers meeting, and that's something that I'd be happy to table.
So just to be clear, you don't have any rules now. Like, it's more consulting and more design.
So at this stage,
forums.
So at this stage, Senator, the department in October last year consulted on 3 potential models for reform, with the Minister having the support of her state and territory colleagues to take on packaging regulatory reform. The department is going through the analysis of that consultation and will be developing further advice for government on what a preferred model could be. But separate to that, in parallel, we have released guidance to industry and all stakeholders on what better design for packaging looks like from our perspective.
But looks like, but that's not something you can compel them to do, correct?
At this stage, no, Senator. So from our perspective, what we have released is simply guidance. It is something that we think would fit well in a reformed world. It's a no regrets kind of approach that we're taking. We think it will certainly give a signal to the direction that industry needs to take to improve its packaging design, but it is something, Senator, that we will consider in the development of new regulation in terms of how that could be embodied in rules or mandatory rules.
But we are getting there, are we? Look. For example, Visi said in their submission to the Senate they don't want any more guidelines. That companies need rules.
Yep.
But it sounds like even industry themselves are calling for this kind of certainty. I mean, I'm not suggesting that the department tried to mislead me over 6 months ago that these things would be ready to go and they're still nowhere near it. But why is it taking so long?
Maybe you could talk us through the process, Mr. Hutchison.
Yeah, thank you, Senators. So at the beginning of last year, we did establish the working group to provide us, to develop this framework for us. We haven't gone out with a kind of a discrete set of rules. What we have tried to do across the various material streams for packaging is give some, I think, give industry some specific guidance around the qualities of packaging that would need to move it up, sort of a grading framework all the way to something that is fully circular. I must note that what we have done at this point is tried to provide this guidance around recyclability. To take it to the next level and take it to circularity would be another level again, because you would need to take into account other issues relating to emissions and water use, and that is something I think could be, further work. But what we have done through our consultations that have been running in parallel to that working group, developing that advice for us and having since released, is consulted on those preferred options, which include things like whether we just mandate rules under Commonwealth legislation all the way through to a kind of a fully fledged extended producer responsibility scheme for packaging. And that's what we're working through now. So in terms of next steps and the process, it is a matter for us to develop that advice for government off the back of that consultation. I'm also confident that we'll be able to release a summary of that consultation so that there is visibility of what we heard through that.
So in terms of then getting enforceable design standards, which I understand is the exact language...
To me, Chair?
No, I'm still asking questions, Senator. I'll come to you in a second, I promise. In terms of enforceable design standards, which is the language the Minister's used when she's been talking to industry, that's what the government's trying to achieve here. Are you saying that will be delivered parallel to regulatory reform, like on packaging?
No, Senator. In terms of design standards for packaging and mandating better design standards, mandating things like recycled content targets, mandating the restriction or the elimination of chemicals of concern in packaging, particularly as it pertains to food grade packaging, that is something that we would see us achieving through the reform process.
Right, so that's a scheme. That would be the extended producer responsibility scheme. But so the enforceable design standards or design rules would be separate to that then?
They would be part of the scheme.
They would be part of it. That was
in terms of whichever model the government decided to take forward, whether that was an EPR scheme, whether that was just mandated rules. They will be decisions for government. What we've tried to do in order to, I think, keep the momentum within industry and signal where we think better packaging design can go, we've built on the existing material that APCO's got out there with its sustainable guidelines, the best practice we're seeing elsewhere, like in the European Union, as I mentioned, to try and give a really strong sense of the direction. And I would imagine that we, through developing regulation and mandating design and better design of packaging, it is those kinds of better design criteria that we would look to embed in our work.
Okay, sorry,
so
Senator.
they do come back together, Senator. They won't forever be separate pieces of work.
Great. I'll come back to that in a second. Yes, Senator Billick.
Thanks, thanks, Chair. I was also going to ask you about if you were still consulting on packaging regulations and what the process has been. I think you've probably answered that for me, unless you've got anything you want to add.
No, just to reiterate, we will be consulting on on that design framework we have released, acknowledging it is quite a technical document, and we want to make sure we get the settings right. We are confident that it is a really good signpost document at this point, but to Senator Wish-Wilson's question, if this is going to be embedded in mandatory rules, we want to make sure we're getting the settings right so we can affect the change that we want and we don't have perverse outcomes. So ensuring that it's fit for the Australian context based on our systems that surround our packaging supply chain.
Thank you.
Can I just have a little follow-up?
You can indeed. A little follow-up.
So one of the things that has been mentioned, and obviously in any form of change, is that behavioural change. So if you look at both ends of the spectrum, you know, we've got, sure, you can mandate anything you like and cross your fingers that it goes well, or you can, as you say, it's an iterative process, taking a step forward, step forward, step forward. But that whole piece about behavioural change, have you done any work on that aspect? It's not really in your bailiwick, I get that.
So there's a lot of research on behaviour change for environmental issues across the board. I think the consensus in science is now you need to think about the determinants of behaviour, like what Professor Thwaites has called the system, and the behaviours that then engage with those principles that are set around our behaviours. When you think about many of the big environmental topics, like for example housing, mobility, we're usually talking about a systems level of provision, a socio-technical system through which we provide housing or mobility or food or energy, and then the behaviours in which we engage in those systems. So these behaviours are usually not individual choice processes. They're usually culturally formed. And so we are looking in research actually what are those things that form up the cultural aspects of our behaviour. So it's a very important part. But it's hard to see how you then influence that through the measures that you put in place in policy.
Yeah,
Operates
like
at a
how
different
much
level.
is about consumer choice
Yeah.
and do you get people to make
right.
that choice, and how much is about regulations or standards or
That's
adjustments to process. Yeah.
Yeah, and to answer your question, Senator, from our perspective, while I wouldn't characterise any of our work going directly to the heart of sort of community or consumer behaviour, what we are working to do is make the system easier to interact with, like Professor Thwaites was talking about earlier, on curbside harmonisation, making it easier across jurisdictions, across local government areas. So I suppose it's easier for consumers to understand what goes in which bin. It's through our packaging reform scheme, making sure that there's really clear mandatory labelling that works and dovetails into that, so there's clarity about what can go in what bin. So without having done the behavioural work, what we are trying to do is make it as easy for the community to engage with a future reformed world as possible.
Thank you.
No, thank you. So I think you were all in the room when Professor Thwaites was talking about the great work that they've done, the Ministerial Advisory Group has undertaken, and the implementation of the primary recommendations, establishing a national circular economy framework that Minister Plibersek's overseen. Are you able to sort of expand on the development since you last appeared here in regard to the circular economy framework, and can you sort of take us through the development of that framework and its expected impact and why it's so important?
Senator, thank you for the question.
Sorry, I just can't see your name there.
Chloe Bird, sorry, I'll pop that at the front
Thank
here.
you.
So the framework was released in December last year, as Professor Thwaites mentioned. It was heavily informed both by research that the CSIRO have undertaken, as well as by the work of the advisory group over the course of their period when they were convened. As Professor Thwaites said, we worked quite iteratively with the advisory group. There are a number of things that we were able to progress and take on board and put into place as a result of their early advice in April this year. But all of that, as well as our own departmental research, obviously, and consultation with a range of different stakeholders, helped inform the circular economy framework that was released in December this year. One that we consulted with across government departments as well to make sure that there's good buy-in to it. The framework, as I mentioned, released in December, but we've already been able to, I guess, give effect to a range of different policies and programs that incorporate the circular economy into them. I think the current figure is we have about 30 policies and programs across government that embed circular economy policies, principles or approaches in them, which is representing around $150 billion worth of investment. I think we've already mentioned the $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund. There's the $7 billion Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility. We've embedded circularity into the new Federation funding agreement for land transport infrastructure with states and territories, which looks at things like using and optimising recycled content in infrastructure builds. So there's a range of sort of system-wide things that we've been able to do to support the framework. It's got a goal to double circularity by 2035, which we'll be measuring through 3 targets within the framework. Those will also, as I think Professor Thwaites mentioned, are reflected in the Measuring What Matters framework, so we have a way to make sure that the ambitious but we think achievable goal that has been set under the framework can actually be met and measured over time. In addition to that, we've obviously released some pragmatic and direct policies over the last couple of years. One of those is the Environmentally Sustainable Procurement Policy that commenced from the 1st of July last year with construction services procurements at or above $7.5 million by the Commonwealth Government and will be extended to another 3 phases from July this year. We've got a non-mandatory but a voluntary national traceability framework which helps businesses that are looking to track recycled content through their supply chain to do so, consistent with what we hope will be an Australian standard so that it can be adopted and give greater transparency and confidence in the use of recycled content in products. And there's a number of other things that we're also working on. Obviously, the framework sets a very ambitious approach to the future, but what we've tried to do through the framework is to set really some priorities within it. So there are 4 priorities which reflect where Australia has competitive and comparative advantages for a circular economy, and that's been heavily informed by research that the CSIRO has done, and I think gives a signal to industry and to business where they can really focus their efforts over the coming years.
You mentioned doubling the circularity by 2035. How can we achieve that, do you think?
Well, through a range of different...
it's an ambitious target.
It is ambitious, but feasible, yeah. I think it's important to set a target that is a little bit of a stretch, but not so far that you can't actually see that it's possible to meet. There are a number of things that we think need to occur, and I think these are set out in the framework, which is quite a detailed document. But as I said, we've focused on 4 particular sectors where we think Australia, compared to other countries, has a better opportunity to make interventions and to build on our own sort of character, I suppose, to be able to reach that circularity target. So the sectors in the built environment, manufacturing, food and agriculture and resources. We've got some sort of specific elements of the framework that identify particular examples of where we might have opportunities to progress there. For instance, valorising food waste in the food and agriculture sector. There's a lot of opportunities around innovation to help bring those sort of opportunities to bear. So in order to get to that goal and to those targets, we will need to make a range of sort of system-wide changes to give effect to them. But that includes a lot of the things that I've talked about already.
Yeah, thank you. And you also talked about the advantages Australia might have. What sort of advantages do you think we have that can support a shift towards circularity?
Let me just open the framework. We've summarised them there. I will just get to... I think this is based on CSIRO advice as well, so feel free to jump in with additional... we've summarised it, but...
If you want me to jump in the meantime, I'd like to make a comment on the doubling circularity target, if I can. Please. And then also on how do we get there, yep. And then speaking about the generic comparative advantage factors that we have in Australia. So in regard to the target, we used modelling that we've done for the International Resource Panel of the United Nations Environment Programme. CSIRO has done that now 2 times, and we analysed the Australian data therein. And the advantage was that this modelling already had a package that mirrored the Australian circular economy policy that was framing up through the work of the advisory panel to the minister. And so that allowed us then to analyse the pathway for all the 4 indicators that we're looking at, which is the material footprint, the front-end indicator. What we're asking here is how much material enters into the economy, which then after a while will become waste. Then we're looking at material productivity. Material productivity has been overlooked by economists for a long time, but it is a factor of our national productivity. What it mirrors at the highest level, because the physical measurement is done in a complementary sense to the national accounts, what it mirrors is how much value do we get out of every kilogram of material that we use in the economy, a really important figure. Then the recycling rate is the one indicator that is we are most familiar with. The circularity rate then summarizes it. It basically says how much of the material that we use every year comes from secondary sources. Now, in regard to improvement of the circularity rate, if you do a thought experiment, if we would bring all the material that now goes to landfill back into the economy, our circularity rate would increase by somewhere between 1% and 2%. So it's not massive. If we're investing in durability, that means we're focusing on material productivity. We're adding another 2%. Very importantly, we're also having a target on reducing the front end. So the reduction in per capita material footprint then adds another 0.5%, another percent. So in total, when you look at it, through all these measures, we're becoming more circular. But we need to keep in mind that the circularity rate is a measure that is the secondary material as a nominator and all the material that we manage in our economy as the denominator. So the byproducts in agriculture from biomass flows and the very huge amount of mining waste that we also need to manage are part of that denominator. And so the question then is, can we do anything with the mining waste? Is there any economically attractive opportunity in mining waste? And what can we do with the agricultural byproducts? And that then starts to add to our circularity rate. If I may say, there's never 100% circularity, but the potential for Australia might sit anywhere between 15 and 20%, with a lot of restructuring in the economy. But what the research also shows is the short-term economically attractive opportunities are many, and we've heard that from John Thwaites' report in the morning as well. And then in the long term, you see a more beneficial economic outcome if you fully engage in the circular economy. So I hope this is a useful answer.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, Ms. Bird, do you have anything to add?
I could never explain it as well as that. But to go to some of our particular advantages that we think, will really assist in focusing on where we can make the greatest impact. We've got, a really excellent research ecosystem in Australia. I think we're a leader. And we've got fantastic innovation, particularly around materials. We mentioned, John mentioned earlier, a number of different organisations that have done some really interesting and quite innovative work in relation to I think if you think about CSIRO and what they're doing, we've got really good capability in technology innovation. We've got a high standard of reputation around the quality and trust in our products in Australia, a very highly skilled workforce. Although it feels like we have a long way to go, we really do have high recycling rates in Australia compared to other parts of the world. We've got some amazing design capability. We mentioned, I think, on the Circular Economy Advisory Group, we had a representative of Engineers Australia. There's some excellent capability there. We care in Australia. We actually have a culture that cares about this sort of thing. And we've got, actually, we see some increasing investment capital that's quite interested in kind of investing in these areas. And from my own experience, we've got a number of partners internationally, some good export partners and so on, who are quite interested in circularity, and certainly we're in a good position to take advantage of the proximity, particularly to Southeast Asia and other countries in kind of our trade relationships who are moving to circularity as well.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Just before I go to Senator Cadell, could I just ask on this sort of broader topic, the National Waste and Resource Recovery Report from Blue Economy 2024 was just released last week. Perhaps a comment from CSIRO and the department if you've read it. Just at a glance, in the first section, it talks about some snapshots. It says this is for 2022-23 core waste, so those waste managed by the Waste and Resources Recovery sector was up over a 6-year period, for which the data reported the headline waste generation increased by about 8%. Assessed on a per capita basis, waste increased by 0.1% over this time frame. Waste disposal dropped over the 6-year data period, 2022-23, and there's a couple of other bits and pieces in there. Are you confident that some of the changes that you put in place in recent years are going to see this trend reverse? Like, it does seem like things aren't improving, at least in what's been outlined in this report.
I'm happy to go first, Senator, and I think where I'd point to is around the same time the release of the latest reporting on the National Waste Report. Environment Minister's also released a revised National Waste Policy Action Plan. I think there was broad recognition that we weren't tracking towards our 7, particularly the 3 quantitative targets in the National Waste Policy Action Plan, we weren't tracking well. And so what the new action plan does in, I think, a more targeted fashion, identifies 3 priority areas where governments collectively should be focusing their attention, but it also goes on to identify what waste streams and what materials those priorities should then focus on. So in terms of the priority areas for governments to act on, we've highlighted legislation, regulation, policy standards and guidelines. The second is investment in infrastructure, procurement and funding support, and the third is around market development and supporting innovation. And then in terms of the kind of the streams that are lagging, we've identified that organics, building and demolition, ash, hazardous waste, paper and cardboard and timber need more attention. And so what Environment Ministers agreed in December is that now we have this new action plan, each government will go away and develop an implementation plan with those priorities and streams in mind and look to publish them by the middle of the year. And so I think it is an acknowledgement that the previous approach wasn't going to get us to our targets. More needs to be done, and that we see, I think, promise in this new, more targeted approach that has tried to call out, based on the really good data that is coming out through this national waste reporting, on the areas where we think we can sort of move the dial and move the needle more.
Anything to add from CSIRO?
I think I would just, if I may generally say, the fact that waste is growing means we need to address that problem early in the process. That's why the material footprint is so important. If you look, for example, as an example at the German legislation, they now have a legislated target for material footprint, which I think is very ambitious. They want to move from, I think it's 25 tonnes per capita nowadays. They want to move to 8 tonnes per capita by 2050.
Do you know where we are at the moment per capita? I know there's different waste streams.
Yeah, we sit at around 32 tonnes per capita.
Tons, yeah.
We can double check that number for you.
That's a lot per person.
But what that shows you is, 32 is the correct number. That's verified. What that shows you is you need to address the problem early on. You need to invest in redesigning the products that we use, the everyday products that we use. But more importantly, you also need to redesign the housing and construction sector, the way in which we construct roads and bridges, the way in which we provide food, the way in which we use energy. All of this will add up to benefits in the circular economy. But what it means is we're using less material at the front, and then that results in less waste at the end, which is kind of common sense. And therefore, the fact that the government has now decided to have actually a front-end target, I find that from my knowledge of how that has evolved in many different countries that have looked into the circular economy, Japan since 2001, that was an important step to have such a front-end target. We have that now as well, and hopefully it will transform through policy initiative and through businesses and economic incentives in the right place and legislation to get us to this point where we want to be, where end of the day we also see in the waste report less waste as a result.
So just, Ross, if you don't mind, just a question for Mr. Marcello on this same subject. It seems like when you're hearing both from the Environment Department and from CSIRO, which is part of your department, that there's a huge industry role in this, and industry investment, whether it's in manufacturing or new technology. Could you just give the committee a brief overview in the role that DISA plays in the circular economy? And I'm particularly interested in what you got to say, because one of the major resources recovery sectors in Australia is basically saying to some of us, like, we really think responsibility for this should be given to the industry department. Like, the Environment Department has a role to play, but actually a lot of this is actually industry investment. Why don't you have the portfolio?
Look, thanks, Senator. Look, I think the policy problem, if I can answer it this way, the policy problem on circular economy and recycling is a responsibility for the Environment Department, and the research obviously comes from CSIRO. Our department's remit here is really as an enabling contributor. So we obviously see what industry's been feeding into the committee on for example, on plastics. But we don't have any direct policies or programs that try and address this problem. What we do have is a contribution to the ecosystem that Ms Bird mentioned before. So, for example, the cooperative research centres that contribute to that policy and research heft in the system is something that we contribute to. So, and I can give you a couple of examples of the work there. So, for example, I understand that a circular economy priority area was added to the way that CRCs function recently, and as some of the projects that the CRCs have addressed, one is on funding for Enviro-Pacific Services to commercialise environmentally focused technology that turns waste from thermal treatment facilities into construction materials. There's one example. Another one, EQ Plastics, got some funding to develop an upcycling system to convert plastic and tyre waste into higher value graphene. And then one final example, Smart Crete, the CRC got some funding to do some research led by Visi. So we don't have the policy levers in our department that address this problem, but indirectly we work through the CRCs to fund that research ecosystem that Ms Bird was talking about. More broader, when you mention resources, I think we are responsible for the mineral sector, but I don't have that. That's not really what we're talking about here. But yeah, you're talking about the means to address this problem. So that's our contribution to this policy problem. It is very much led by DQ and the research by CSIRO. And so CSIRO colleagues mentioned before the research facility in Western Australia, that was a CSIRO funded program, but that is part of our portfolio. So that's how we try and address this policy problem.
Thank you. Look, I'll come back to that if I have time. Senator Cadell.
After I'm just getting into some low-level stuff. If I could talk about the RMF and how we've gone on allocating that. So do we have the latest co-funding amounts that we've put in and how much has been matched by as part of the RMF?
Certainly, Senator, we do. I'll just find those stats in my paperwork here. So the latest stats I have in terms of what we've put in and the matching amounts, of course the stats are never ready to hand. At an overarching level, we've currently committed $230 million to projects. The bulk of this is through states and territories. Yep. In terms of the funding that they have put in, I might have to take that on notice, actually. My table's not cut quite in that way.
And if you're going to take it on notice, can we get a breakdown by states and territories then as well?
Certainly.
And does that have the number of projects by states and territories? Do you have that, or would that be on notice as well?
I do have the number of projects per
Because Western Australia was poorly represented. I think they started some but couldn't deliver, is my understanding, in Western Australia.
A lot of states have had some projects come in and then come out of the... due to various factors, supply chain disruptions. Actually, sorry, Senator, I've just found the amounts from of the contributions. So of committed money, we've got $200 million from the Australian government, $175 million from states and territories, and then from third-party investments, $638 million.
Okay. Can I still get the breakdown by state on notice? I don't need it now.
Sure.
Okay. And the number by states and territories as well would be good?
Certainly.
Okay. The $200 million from us, you gave 230 originally and 200 in that answer. Is that committed versus spent, or what are we? Yeah.
So 200 is the amount that's allocated to specific projects. Right. So that's right, and locked and loaded to go with the states. There are others that are in
how
the
much
pipeline.
has been distributed and how much is still in?
In terms of how much has been distributed, I think all of that. I'll confirm, but I think all of that 200 is sort of locked and loaded with the states.
Are there any more projects waiting assessment? Do you know how many?
Not waiting assessment, but there are some that are waiting to be fully executed.
Right, so every one that's applied under RMF has been assessed and just yayed or nayed?
That's right, that's my understanding. There's a few kind of final details yet to be settled.
Right.
Yeah, and haven't been announced yet.
Understand that. Yep. How many haven't been announced yet?
I can't reveal yet.
I'm not asking which ones haven't been announced yet.
Quite a few that have, though, I can tell you, is 142 projects have been announced and are proceeding.
Right. But we don't know how many haven't been announced. No, that's fine. That's all I have on that. I just want to get some stuff. We heard, it was actually a little bit, Dr. Schandl's answer was nice about the input costs, but what was concerning is the numbers about 1 to 2% of landfill being reduced by circularity, 1 to 2% by product stewardship. Still going to be a lot of landfill going forward under any way, shape or form. And as we come back to that, how many, do we know, the department know how many landfills currently exist across Australia?
Senator, no, we don't have that information because it's largely held by states and territories that they gather from local governments.
Right. Do we...
Do you mind if I jump in and say, just to make that clear, we were talking about the circularity rate, and how we're improving that, not the recycling rate. And the point I made as a thought experiment, if we divert everything that goes into landfill, put it back into the economy, it increases our circularity by about anywhere between 1% and 2%.
That's everything from landfill.
Apologies. Thank you, Senator.
So the things when we don't recycle that end up there, we don't know how many landfills, we don't know how much is going into them. Does the department look at that sort of stuff? Yeah.
We do have statistics in the National Waste and Resource Recovery reporting, which is online, that says a total volume of waste to landfill. And so the most recent stats for the financial year 22-23 was 22 million tonnes. And that's down from 23.3 million tonnes in the prior financial year, and down from 22.6 in 2016-17.
So I'm just finding out how much we know, and I probably could have read more and answered this myself. I'm sorry, I'm a bit lazy. Do we look at methane emissions, which is a reportable thing from landfill? Do you guys look at that as well as DQ, looking at that and monitoring that from all landfills or big landfills or no landfills? Do we account for that?
Methane is reported separately. And we'd have to take those specific questions on notice unless others here can answer.
Can we take that on notice? What's the method for that, and how many sites do we get stats from? Because I imagine there's some small landfills that we probably don't look at versus how many are big ones. And so basically, are all landfills reporting emissions?
We'll take that on notice.
Okay. And that's when we talk about gathering resources, if we're also able to look at how many of those landfills are trying to capture or have projects to capture their methane.
Okay, we'll take that on notice as well.
That's all I have for that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chair. I've just got a couple of things I'd like to get through fairly quickly, but if I could just come back to Mr. Hutchison, a question asked earlier about, I was told in May last year that the design rules would be ready in a few months. What's the key reason for the delay? I mean, I understand it's complex. Is it just the lack of resources in the department? Is it a priority issue, or is it just that this has turned out to be more complicated than you thought?
Senator, I think the answer to the question, so it's not around resourcing, it's not around, I think there is a degree of complexity to it. Certainly where I think we're at the moment is working through the modelling that we've been doing over the past year or so, working that into the consultation that we did in October last year, and trying to come up with and work that through in terms of taking further information to government to support a decision on the reform model and what model packaging reform can take. I think to have come out with rules at the end of the year, it's probably more, and I think the best description of it is perhaps the journey we've been going on this reform project. Certainly, as part of reform, we do want to see mandated design rules so that there is absolute clarity and responsibility for industry to take responsibility for what's going on in the market. But as we go through the shape of reform, and as I mentioned in that October paper, we had the 3 different models we've tested. I don't think it would have necessarily then made sense to come out 2 months later and say, here are our mandated design rules, because it will then be potentially confusing if we were to, where it just wouldn't necessarily fit perfectly with our preferred model or the government's preferred model when it gets to that decision. So I think it's probably been an evolution of how we've got to that point over the course of 2024. Right. But what we did do, noting that design is a critical component, we released that guidance on better design for packaging, and particularly for the packaging as it enters the curbside recycling framework. And as I was describing to senators before, that making sure it's fit for the Australian context, we think that there is a really strong signal in that to say that we will mandate rules around this, but this is some general guidance about the direction you need to go. So it's kind of signalling to industry that we're on that journey.
Okay, and sitting, I suppose, parallel to that process is, as we said before, the broader reform around a scheme. Will we see any details on this in the next couple of months before an election?
Senator, it's not for me to preempt any decisions of government, but what I have previously indicated to the committee is we now have our grading framework out there. We're doing more consultation on that, but in terms of a timing for decisions and announcements on preferred models, it's a matter for government.
Would it be fair to say you're not there yet, though, in terms of finishing these processes? So the government can't really make a decision until you finish
We are still working through, I think, the outcomes of our consultations last year and working through the processes to take advice to government.
In relation to those consultations, I'm sure some of them are with APCO and what they've given evidence. We've looked at their strategic plan. What's the status of the department's work on reviewing and, I suppose, potential approval of APCO's strategic plan?
Sure. So
is that going to be the framework going forward?
Senator, I mean, again, without preempting a decision of government, what we did have in our consultation paper last year, we had some 426 submissions come in. I can't recall off the top of my head if APCO was one of them, but one of the options that we did test on was a strengthened existing co-regulatory arrangement as kind of the status quo as the base level case to test. We also tested mandatory rules under Commonwealth legislation and the EPR scheme, as I mentioned. APCO last year did release its strategic plan and has taken that to environment ministers. Within that, it does, you were talking to Professor Thwaites earlier around APCO's plans to change its fee structure to include eco-modulated fees.
Yeah.
And it is pursuing that path in response to the tasking from environment ministers that while reform is being undertaken...
Sorry, can I just clarify that, Mr Hutchison, tasking from environment ministers, does that mean that they've signed off on it or that you've signed off on it?
So sorry. About 12 months ago, all environment ministers wrote to APCO saying more needs to be done to achieve the national packaging targets. So as part of APCO's response to that, it's looking at what it can do within its own domain to improve that progress while the reform work goes on and separate to that. So it is not a reasonable conclusion to draw that APCO's model will be the reform model. That's a decision for government. Environment ministers have noted APCO's strategic plan.
You've noted it, but just to be really clear, you haven't signed off on it?
Environment ministers haven't endorsed the plan.
Or the federal minister?
It's a matter for environment ministers, so we're continuing to work with the states and territories on it as APCO rolls it out.
Right, but sorry, just to come back to this point, I'm trying to pin you down on this, but has it been signed off by anyone?
It's been noted by environment ministers.
Noted but not signed off. Okay, all right. I'll go away and work out what the difference is there, but presumably it doesn't mean it hasn't been approved if it's only been noted. Could I ask the proposed APCO strategic plan makes no mention of export provisions under the RAW Act, and obviously given the RMF, even though we've just gone through some allocations, delivers, I suppose, a limited amount of packaging recycling capacity. Do we still continue to require export regimes to avoid landfilling in Australia?
Do you mean, Senator, in terms of...
for different product streams, like especially paper and cardboard or mixed paper?
So the regulations require exporters to get licences
That's right.
and have a certain amount of treatment. There is a process that perhaps my colleague can talk to about verification of customers so that we are ensuring that the materials are handled appropriately in importing countries. To avoid them going to landfill.
But is this included under APCO's strategic plan? Sorry, so that's my question. Obviously, it's under the RAW Act, but is it part of their strategic plan? Like, is there any mention of the export provisions?
That might be a question for APCO, I think.
Yeah, and it's not one that I can answer directly right now, Senator.
No worries. Just a broader one, based on Mr Thwaites' presentation and his report, which we've only read in the last couple of days. The Circular Economy Act, or the Circularity Act, whatever you want to call it, it's an interesting recommendation based on overseas experience. Is the department, what's the process now that report's been released? Obviously it's not binding on you in any way, but is there been any advice provided by the department to the Minister on a Circular Economy Act, which is the key recommendation of the report?
Well, I might actually just defer to my colleague. We are presently undertaking a statutory review of the Recycling and Waste Reduction Act, and
Correct.
as Professor Thwaites said, the input that's been provided by the Circular Economy Ministerial Advisory Group is certainly an input that we're considering as part of that review, but I might defer to you to talk about the process a bit. Yep.
Sure. So, as you're well aware, we are reviewing the Recycling and Waste Reduction Act. As a part of that, we're looking at the views of the Circular Economy Ministerial Advisory Group, also taking into account submissions that have previously been made through this inquiry and the Productivity Commission inquiry. The terms of reference of the review do allow us to consider that, because it does. It is specifically looking at both the operations of the current Act and the extent to which the objects of the Act have been achieved. And in particular, if you look at the terms of reference, it says that the review will make recommendations to improve the efficiency and impact of the Act, and draw your attention to this part, in addressing the current and future circular economy needs. So it's certainly within the scope of the review to look at that recommendation.
Okay. Yeah, well, I'm sure. Could you just remind us when the Raw Act review submission process finishes?
In mid-year. So at the moment we're going through the consultation process.
So it'll be after an election when all the stuff's been, just by coincidence. I'm not making any point about that, except it'll be mid-year before we can actually get the information on the Raw Act, and then maybe a new government may look at a Circularity Act.
How the review is handled is a matter for government.
Right, okay. Could I have, in terms of the submissions to the packaging stewardship scheme, I know there was lots of submissions and plenty from industry. Are you able to give us like an idea, back of envelope or otherwise, as to how many were supportive of a mandated, extended producer responsibility scheme?
Sure, Senator. I don't have statistics here in front of me, but
could you take it on notice if possible?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is as I think I mentioned earlier, and if I didn't, have to say now that it is our intent to release information quite shortly around the outcomes of that consultation, which would go to kind of the broad stakeholder views. So very happy to do it.
If you could, because I to be honest, the evidence we've heard throughout the inquiries, there seems to be pretty broad support across industry now for some kind of certainty around this and support of the scheme. So any idea when you'll release that?
Shortly, Senator, but what I think I feel confident in agreeing with your assessment in terms of what you've heard from industry stakeholders. Again, I don't have the numbers or the figures to support this because the team's finalising its analysis, but I think it's pretty fair to say that there was strong support for an EPR scheme from our industry stakeholders, and I think we'll see that reflected in our summary.
Great. Okay. Just one quick question on batteries. Obviously, there's been New South Wales, and I saw some information from the Queensland government recently. The states are moving on this, but I just wonder if the Commonwealth is using any of its kind of import powers to bolster the regulatory environment around batteries.
Thank you. At the moment, no, we don't have any existing plans to use the import powers, but we are working quite closely with New South Wales because they're obviously looking at what exists at a national level in relation to the National Television and Computer Recycling Scheme and the voluntary stewardship arrangements that exist, which include an accredited scheme for B-Cycle. So we're working with New South Wales to talk through and to discuss how those arrangements work, so as they work through their legislation, we can make sure that it's all complementary.
So you may not have any plans to use the federal or Commonwealth heads of powers, but has it been looked at? Have you done, for example, have you provided any advice on whether that could help the current crisis in battery recycling or?
So under the auspices of the Environment Ministers meeting earlier, I can't remember the exact date, but the Queensland Government representatives took on some work on batteries, and they did look at the range of different powers and opportunities that exist at a state and a federal level that could be deployed potentially to assist with batteries. Then obviously Victoria and New South Wales took on some more specific work looking at how that might be given effect through specifically state legislation in relation to, you know, a more kind of targeted or focused proportion of the batteries, the ones that are considered to be causing most issues at the moment. So work has been done across by Queensland to look at the various ways in which things could work together. I beg your pardon?
It doesn't sound like the Commonwealth's going to add to this at all at the moment.
Oh, well, we consulted, as you know, on the potential to either expand or replace the National Television and Computer Recycling Scheme, which was broader than batteries, but obviously batteries came up as a very specific and primary concern under that. And with states and territories having the predominant lead, and you know, they are experiencing a lot of these issues most directly in their own systems, it was a matter of urgency for them, which is why New South Wales is taking that forward.
On that, I might just follow up with a question on the same theme in relation to banning single-use items, and obviously the states. Many of the states, I should say, and sadly not my home state of Tasmania, have gone down the road of banning some single-use plastics, for example, or problematic plastics.
Shout out to South Australia.
Very big shout out to South Australia. It's led on just about everything in this Senate inquiry over many years, indeed. So I'll just, in the plastics plan, and once again I know the 2021 plastic plan wasn't a binding document to the federal government, but it did mention in the plastics plan the Commonwealth also using heads of power to ban some items. Has there been any advice provided by the department to the Minister in relation to that? Using our own regulatory powers?
Senator, I think at the moment on problematic single-use plastics, it's probably best to describe our activity around continuing to coordinate with the states on identifying the 24 items that they have committed to. So there is that harmonisation agenda. And in December 24, ministers agreed to a roadmap to, I think, harmonise on that agenda as much as possible. In terms of the Commonwealth's ability to regulate specific items, we're obviously looking at it particularly through packaging, that lens, and identifying... Through
your packaging reform?
Yeah, so far as it would relate to problematic forms of packaging or unnecessary forms of packaging. But largely what we have been trying to prosecute is a harmonisation of the existing agenda run by states and territories.
Okay, just in relation to the design rules, or if you like, more broadly principles, we received evidence when we had a hearing in New South Wales that the New South Wales government's looking at doing this themselves if the Commonwealth government doesn't come to the party. Sense some frustration in their evidence. Is it something that you would mirror? Where is the New South Wales government at the moment in relation to looking at their own design rules for packaging? Is this something that you're taking on board in your broader scope for our own design?
I think it's fair to say, Senator, we're aware that New South Wales has made announcements about its actions on plastics, and I won't speak for what it's doing and its push on design. However, I think what the Minister does have quite clearly through the Environment Ministers Forum is support from her state and territory colleagues to take on the regulatory reform of packaging, and I haven't seen that support waver. So.
Okay. So are we going to beat them to the punch?
Sorry?
Are we going to beat them to the punch?
I think it was a question you asked earlier, Senator, about whether progress has been made. I think we are making good progress. We have got that design guidance out there now. I think we've got the consultation that we've just completed, and we are bringing that together to help inform a government decision. And I think that will give a lot of momentum, and we'll keep working with the states and territories to make sure that there is, I think, a really clear transition period between when Commonwealth reform can take place and what the current arrangements look like, so that there is, I think, a continuation of momentum, noting that we know the current system isn't working, but we'll continue to work really closely with the states and territories on it because they are part of the current system as well. So I think
it's a commitment from all environment ministers that the Commonwealth lead. So that's...
Okay. So, sorry, Ms Bird, could you just say that again?
It's a commitment from all environment ministers
Yeah.
that the Commonwealth lead on packaging. So I think that's the approach.
Senator Curry had a follow-up question.
One last thing, I had a flashback while other people were talking. The one thing that was criticism of some witnesses early under the RMF is there was a lot of MRF funding in the original fund, so we're lots of sorting and storing but not a lot of production. Do you keep a breakdown of what categories in production, processing or MRFs?
We'd have some breakdown. I don't have that information.
Put that on
I do actually have those earlier figures about the states.
Let's go.
So of the 142 projects that were announced nationally, we have 41 in New South Wales, 27 in Victoria, 24 in Queensland, 15 in South Australia, 15 in WA, 6 in Tasmania, 12 in the Northern Territory, 1 in the ACT, and then 1 in external territories.
Okay.
And of all of those, we've got 68 in rural and remote areas.
Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, thank you. Look, a question on the Minister's priority list. We've talked about this a few times around product stewardship progress on solar PV. Could you give us an update on where that's at? I know it was a key focus following the May 2022 election, and a public survey of the proposed regulation was open from June 2023 to the 23rd of July. So, yeah, could you give us an update on that, whether we're going to see anything on that before in the next couple of months?
Certainly we've been doing some work on solar panels, including examining technologies that are available for recycling, looking at the market, obviously. That's included some work where we've been doing some quite detailed analysis of the differential between costs and revenues involved in solar panel recycling, which is obviously a really necessary input for us to be able to understand how we might be able to design a scheme to best address that. We've been testing
Ms. Bird,
that with...
It sounds very reasonable to me what you're saying, but
Yep.
I'm just wondering why this wasn't done 2 years ago.
Well, there's a timeline, I suppose. I think, as you're aware, the solar panels was listed on the Minister's the priority list a number of years ago under the national... I believe I have to look the data in front of me, but there was a co-design process with industry, which was led by the Product Stewardship Centre of Excellence to see whether the major industry stakeholders could come together to design an industry-led scheme. That was quite I believe the process went for about 6 months or so, and following that, it became clear that wasn't something that would be able to be industry-led at that point in time, which is why then we've progressed to looking at regulatory action from the Commonwealth and looking into this sort of level of detail that will be required to inform a policy impact assessment, cost-benefit analysis and that sort of
So regulation coming in the next couple of months? Or
as I said, we're working on the inputs that we need to be able to do a policy impact assessment and cost-benefit analysis, which is all necessary precondition to be able to regulate.
In terms of one of those inputs, I don't know if CSIRO or the industry department could answer this as well, but what tangible progress has been made in rates of recovery for solar PV? You mentioned revenues and costs, but what about the technical aspects of it? Is that something there's been any specific research projects on?
So some of the work that we're looking at, and I don't have the specific breakdown here, but it is looking at some of the technology that's available. I mean, there's varying levels of quality of recovery. Some of that can range from just, basically smashing it up to actually recovering the gold and the silver and the other critical minerals that are in there. So we're kind of scoping that to see what the gradations of quality are that are out there. I'd probably have to take it on notice to get to the specific recovery rates that currently exist, unless others have it to hand.
Chair, we do some work not only on the recovery and the potential of recovery, but also the next generation of PV. I'll take that on notice, if you like, and provide that to to your committee. I'm just wondering, Alessio, if you want to make any comments around this, especially around critical minerals.
Yeah, thank you. I've not worked on solar panels here in Australia. I did study them when I was in the States, in the United States. So I cannot comment on what's the current rate here. I know that in the US it was very low. It might have been 5–10%. One of the reasons is also that, solar panels have a lifetime of maybe 20 years. And so what we see now is that the old solar panels coming out of the system and the ramp up in installation means that basically you're going to have those solar panels in 20 years out. So there is this delay between when they're installed and when they become waste. And so at the moment, the sheer amount of solar panels entering the waste stream is pretty low compared to what is installed. And I assume it's going to be similar in Australia, but honestly, I don't know.
I think that's right. I mean, we do have estimates about that they will rise. So at the moment, I think it's at 52,000 tonnes that we're expecting solar panel waste to be in 2024. We're expecting that to rise to about 90,000 tonnes in 2030. So you can see that as the older technology starts to come off roofs, it will increase. But we may not have had a great experience of it to date for the reasons just described.
Okay. All right, well, it's just, unless the senators have any other questions, we've got to finish up in the next few minutes. So just to if I could just perhaps ask this last question. So with the review of the RORAC coming up, it's a statutory review, with the information that you're preparing on design rules or guidelines, packaging reform, potential for a new Circular Economy Act, it's not, given the submission process on the ROAR Act and the timeline takes it through to mid next year, it's not likely we're going to get any decision in the months ahead around, or any information in the months ahead around an extended producer responsibility scheme that may or may not include design rules. Is that a reasonable conclusion to draw?
Senator, again, not for me to preempt the timing of decisions of government, but as I mentioned earlier, we are still working to bring that analysis and advice together. So, I couldn't speak to when you'll see something from the government. That is absolutely a matter for the government, but we're working through it and we'll get it to them.
Okay. Any last questions? Well, thank you for your time today, and we may put more detailed questions on notice. In case you missed it a little bit earlier, the time for getting responses back will be Friday, 21st February, which will be next week, and we'll get those questions for you. I'd like to have had more time with you, Mr. Marcelo, but thanks for coming. And I'll now conclude the hearing. Thank you all for your time today. That concludes today's public hearing. Thank you to all the witnesses who appeared and to Hansard Broadcasting and the Secretariat for their assistance, and the committee stands adjourned.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.